Hello, and how nice it is to be back for another episode of Formula One for Fummies. Given that we're just in time for the start of the Canadian Grand Prix weekend, I thought it best to make today's episode about the three current teams leading F1 at the moment, and to perhaps explain why they are currently so far ahead of the rest. So for those that don't know, the three teams are Ferrari, Mercedes, and Red Bull Racing. So I think let's keep it short and sweet, and let me go straight into discussing Ferrari, the first team on the list. So for those of you that don't know Ferrari, welcome to the real world. You must have been living under some kind of massive boulder with some hectic, sensory deprivation capabilities, because if you don't know who Ferrari is, then I don't really know. So Ferrari is the team with the longest history in Formula One. It is the name probably most synonymous with, motorsport and Formula One specifically. And Ferrari is the only team that has participated in F1 from the very beginning. So as you can imagine, they've won many championships in the 1950s and in the 1970s, and then most recently in the late 90s and early 2000s, they were basically at their best, and those times are regarded as golden eras for them. Recently, it hasn't been going that well, with the last championship that they won coming with Kimi Räikkönen in 2007. So it's now been 12 years since Ferrari last won a world championship for either a driver or for the constructors. So the current drivers are Sebastian Vettel, who you might know, and Charles Leclerc, who is a new young driver, an up-and-coming driver, and a very talented, promising driver for the future. With the team principal, so the team principal, for those who don't know, is basically the president of the team. So he is the guy basically in charge of running the drivers, running the engineers, running the mechanics, the aerodynamicists. He's basically in charge of running the whole operation inside the team. So the team principal is Mattia Binotto, and the name might sound familiar if you listen to my TF1 podcast, because I speak about him quite frequently, since he's sort of also the spokesperson for the team in terms of explaining, what the team did wrong or whether the team did well or not. He basically explains what's going on with the team. I think if you need to think about Ferrari, and the first, impression that you get from them is they're a very passionate team. They're obviously very passionate about motorsport and motor racing, given the fact that they have been involved in the sport for so long and that they're such a legendary name in the sport. If you think about, the most famous images of Formula One, you probably would think about Ferrari and at a track like Monza. So Monza is an Italian track, the Italian Grand Prix. All of them, just the whole crowd decked out in red, and it's just Ferrari flags everywhere. And it's just an incredible spectacle to see if during the Italian Grand Prix when Ferrari races at home. And then for those that are interested, there's an actual name for the Ferrari supporters in Italy. It's called the Tifosi. So if you hear people talking about the Tifosi on the television, they're basically referring to all of the Ferrari supporters as a collective, are known as the Tifosi. Now, as you can imagine, as I've mentioned, since they're a very Italian team, they're very passionate, but then at the same time, it can quite often lead to their downfall, since they're just frequently not as organized as, a team like Mercedes or Red Bull. I don't know whether that's an Italian thing, but let's just say it's been very consistently shown over the course of history that Ferrari is sometimes a bit more, let's say, scatterbrained in terms of strategy and in terms of organization than some of the other teams. But in the same breath, it is also said that almost all drivers in F1 dream of driving for Ferrari one day. So there's an incredible myth around Ferrari, and just the absolute honor for being a driver for Ferrari is something that almost no F1 driver can resist. Whether Ferrari is on top or not, people would go to Ferrari just for the privilege of driving for them. A few famous past drivers. So I think most of you will probably know about Michael Schumacher. He was, him and Ferrari were the golden team driver combination in the early 2000s, and they basically won everything in sight. Another famous driver is Niki Lauda, who recently passed away. Kimi Räikkönen, as I mentioned before, who won the last championship with them, and Alain Prost, the famous French driver who was Ayrton Senna's greatest rival in the late 80s and early 90s. Okay, and then I think lastly, just for some context when looking at a race now, Ferrari over the past few years has been the main sort of competition for Mercedes, who has been the team that has dominated the sport most recently. So they are still very much up there, and this year there was a big expectation on them to come and knock Mercedes off their perch. Up to now, it hasn't quite yet materialized, but as I've mentioned on Twitter, I think the Canadian Grand Prix this weekend might be actually their chance to really assert themselves. Cool. Next, let's speak about Mercedes, the team of the team du jour, or the team of the year so far. They were one of the first teams in Formula One back in the 1950s when it started up, but they left the sport quite quickly, so they didn't really stay in the sport for that long after joining right from the outset. Quite a famous image for Mercedes is at that time was the fact that they had these very sleek silver cars and were usually known as the Silver Arrows, which is a name that they've now readopted when they came back into the sport in 2010 with an all-German driver lineup of Nico Rosberg, and at that stage a whole entire Michael Schumacher that was making a comeback. I mean, when Mercedes announced that Michael Schumacher was coming back, the whole world lost their minds because Schumacher was such a legendary driver with Ferrari, so for him to make a return with the German team seemed very appropriate and very romantic in a sense. Now, to be honest, it didn't go that well, Michael Schumacher's comeback, after being soundly beaten by Nico Rosberg over the period that they were teammates. And Mercedes just didn't have the car at that time to really put Schumacher at the front of the pack. Well, just after Schumacher left, so in 2012 he left, and from 2014 onwards, Mercedes has been the dominant team in Formula One up to now. They won the last 5 drivers and 5 constructors championships, which is obviously a massively impressive feat. They're also a very, very big team with, I think they now have over 1,000 people working for the team, which if you think about how big Formula One teams used to be 10 or 20 years back, it's an incredible amount of people, all to build basically 2 cars and to win races. Mercedes is known for just their efficiency and for really very rarely making any mistakes in terms of their car design, or just in terms of winning races or managing a race at any point in time. Their current drivers is Lewis Hamilton, who is the current world champion and also a very well-known driver across the world, and Valtteri Bottas, a guy from Finland. Their team principal is Toto Wolff, an Austrian man who's very tall and he's very intimidating, and he is extremely good at his job since he has built up this Mercedes team to be virtually unbeatable at the moment. So yeah, he is doing an excellent job. Other than that, Mercedes is also famous for the very intense and toxic rivalry and competition between Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton a few years back, with Lewis Hamilton winning 2 championships and Rosberg 1, after which Rosberg promptly retired, never to return again. So that was at the end of 2016, with Valtteri Bottas then brought in to partner Hamilton from 2017 onwards. Some famous past drivers for Mercedes, Stirling Moss and Juan Manuel Fangio, are drivers that drove for Mercedes in the 1950s, back in the day when Mercedes also sort of swept aside all of the competition before them, and they are seen as legendary drivers in their own right. Even in today, people still think that they are 2 of the best drivers to have ever driven in Formula One. And then more recently, as I've mentioned before, Michael Schumacher was also a very big and important driver for Mercedes, in the first few years after they made their return to Formula One. Now this year, Mercedes is still the team to beat. They are way ahead of everybody else. They basically finished first and second for the first 5 races, and now the previous race in Monaco, they came first and third. So they are definitely still very much ahead in this World Championship, with Ferrari and Red Bull, the team that we're going to talk about next, a distant second and third. So let's talk about Red Bull. So Red Bull was the dominant team before Mercedes sort of made their massive comeback. They started in 2004 with Red Bull buying the Jaguar team, and they sort of spent the first 2 years building up the team to really make them into a team that can contend at the front. And by the time about 2009 came along, they were up there winning races and really competing for the big titles. So I think the important thing to note about Red Bull is that they're not a works team. Now, when I say a works team is a team like Ferrari and Mercedes. So it is a big car manufacturer that then also has a Formula One team and that can manufacture their own engines, and it's all one big integrated, organization and exercise where the car and the engine and everything is produced in tandem. Now, Red Bull does not work like that. So as you probably know, Red Bull is not known for, automotive vehicles. Red Bull is known for energy drinks and as a supplement to some very colorful alcoholic beverages. And therefore, they don't have a large, road car division of which they can leverage, for example, in terms of building an engine or something like that. So Red Bull as a team design the chassis or design, the car and all of the aerodynamic parts and the suspension and everything like that. And then they buy their actual engine from Honda, which is a big motor manufacturer, as you should know. So just as a point of information, Red Bull not being a works team obviously has some advantages and some disadvantages, and you'll see there when we discuss all of the other teams in Formula One in the next episode. I'll highlight which teams are works teams and which teams are not works teams, just for more information purposes. So the current drivers for Red Bull are Max Verstappen, a young Dutchman who's also a very big talent for the future, and Pierre Gasly, a Frenchman that has joined the team for the first time this year. Their team principal is Christian Horner, and I'm going to be super upfront and say I personally do not like Horner very much. I feel that he is too quick to prioritize one driver over another, and he just rubs me the wrong way, to be honest. But he, in his defense, he has done such a brilliant job in, firstly getting Red Bull to the top and then also keeping them amongst the really top 3 teams, even after their real period of domination ended. So I guess kudos to Christian Horner. Another interesting thing to mention about the Red Bull team is that they have the Red Bull Junior Development Program, which was a first, in Formula One, where they really sort of talent scouted very young drivers in karting, and then sort of paid for them to, move up through all of the different levels of motor racing to then eventually end up driving for their junior team, Toro Rosso. So Red Bull has a second team in Formula One called Toro Rosso, which is basically Red Bull in Italian. And usually their sort of more junior, less experienced drivers would then drive for Toro Rosso, and if they perform well enough, they would then be moved up into the main team, being Red Bull. And a few examples of this being, Sebastian Vettel first drove for Toro Rosso and then moved up to Red Bull. Max Verstappen, Daniel Ricciardo, Carlos Sainz, all of them were Red Bull juniors who first drove for Toro Rosso and then was moved up into either Red Bull, or then, if they didn't make the actual Red Bull contract, then they would, most often move to other teams like Carlos Sainz did, for example, now being at McLaren. All right, so I think it's worth mentioning that Red Bull, as I've mentioned or alluded to earlier, they won 4 World Championship doubles, so both the Drivers' and the Constructors' Championship with Sebastian Vettel from 2010 to 2013, after which Vettel then up sticks and left to Ferrari. As I've mentioned before, the allure of Ferrari is, in most cases just too much, and Vettel really found the idea of driving for Ferrari very attractive, even though he probably didn't really move to a team that performed that much better at that stage. And I think the main reason for this, and I think one of the main reasons that Red Bull has managed to remain so competitive for so long at Formula One, is because they have a secret weapon. And that secret weapon is called Adrian Newey, who is probably the top aerodynamic designer in the world. And he has consistently delivered cars for Red Bull that are so well designed, that are very fast and very efficient. And, despite Red Bull maybe not always having the most powerful engine, they were still able to remain competitive, not necessarily to always win races or win championships, but to be up there and still compete for, the top places and the podiums in the sport. Okay, so that was a short overview for for that discusses the top 3 teams in the sport at the moment. And then I just quickly want to discuss the reason that I feel these 3 teams are so far ahead of everybody else, of all of the other teams. And I think the most obvious thing is just these teams have a massive amount of money, and more money than all of the other teams. They're the largest, they have the most people employed, and they have the biggest budgets. So the amount of money they can pool and pour into like designing the car for the next year or for the next race is just more. And I mean, it's basic maths. The more you spend in developing and designing, the chances are you're probably going to get a very, very good product. It doesn't always turn out that way. I mean, a team like McLaren also has a massive budget, and it's not been going well for them recently. But just having that money available already sets you up to really, really challenge for the top. Just because if you think about how complex a Formula One car is, all of those parts, are made out of carbon fiber and carbon composites. And those parts cost money to design. You need to manufacture these parts, and you need to then ship them to a track where it can be tested. And if a part doesn't work, then if you have more resources to go and change it and then bring it back, over the same weekend or over a short period of time, obviously you're going to gain an advantage at some stage if you can just produce more and develop more faster. As easy as that. Another thing I think that money contributes towards is the fact that, all of these big teams have wind tunnels on site that they can basically use to simulate, the real world and for them to better understand how their aerodynamics will actually work on the car. Something that the smaller teams can either not use as frequently or just can't afford to really have an in-house wind tunnel that for convenience purposes obviously leaves them at a disadvantage. Then fourthly, the prize money in Formula One also provides an advantage to the teams that perform the best. So for example, if you are Mercedes and you win 90% of the races in the season, you are by far and away going to get the most money, as part of the prize for doing that well. And that money is then compounded and added to the already sizable budget that the Mercedes has. And then, just further leads to this massive inequality between the teams in terms of their capabilities. Having more money then also means you're probably going to hire the best people. You can, hire the best engineers, the best aerodynamicists, and then also make it more difficult for them to leave to other teams, for them to apply their expertise there. And then lastly, given all of the above, if there is something like a regulation change, the team with all of these resources is probably going to be able to get more of a head start in terms of interpreting and applying any new rules than a team that just doesn't have these resources available. So that's, I think, definitely what we saw with Mercedes when they changed all of the rules in 2017, where teams have started to close up to Mercedes to an extent, I think, in 2016. And then in 2017, the gap was as big as ever because Mercedes was again able to just use all of these resources and produce a car that is just better than everybody else's. And it's been, they've been trying to catch up ever since. And I think that just, if you do watch the Canadian Grand Prix this weekend and you are trying to understand why there's such a massive gap in time between the top 6 drivers and everybody else, it's mainly because of what I've just mentioned. And it's a problem that Formula One is trying to address, where they are trying to standardize some aspects of, what all of the cars have to run, where maybe all of the cars need to have the same parts for specific areas. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what they do come up with for, future rule changes to try and address this massive inequality that we're currently seeing in the teams. So that's that for today. I hope you now know a bit more about the top teams specifically. Next week's episode will deal with the Formula 1.5 teams, also known as the midfield teams. As I've mentioned in the first 2 episodes, please go and subscribe, rate and comment on whichever platform you listen on. If you have any specific questions or topics that you would like me to cover, leave a comment and I can try and see where I can, fit it in. We are available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castbox, Stitcher and many more. Please also listen and subscribe to the TF1 show, my main podcast, if you're interested in the more intricate details of F1. Then finally, I'm on Twitter as @TF1show and on Instagram as @TheTF1show. Please connect with me and I'm always keen for a chat on Formula One. We'll see you next time. Bye bye.